Hi, my name is James Barron, and I'd like to welcome you to our Zoom with David Areford today. It's really a distinct pleasure to have David, who visited the gallery, saw our exhibition, Sol LeWitt, Irrational Thoughts. David is a professor of art history at University of Massachusetts in Boston. He's the author of an astounding book called Strict Beauty, Sol LeWitt's Prints, published by Yale University Press in 2020. I'd like everybody to understand this is not just a book about Sol LeWitt's prints. It's about the general huge thought and ethos of Sol LeWitt, and I recommend it to everybody. It's actually one of the finest books written on Sol LeWitt. He was a finalist for the College Art Association's Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award, and he's also the editor of Locating Sol LeWitt, also published by Yale University Press, 2021, which was selected as one of the best art books of 2021 by the editors of Art News and Art in America. David is the author of other books and essays on 15th-century European printmaking and devotional art. His current project is tentatively titled Sol LeWitt To and From Painting. David, welcome. How are you today?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm well. I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's really a pleasure. I enjoyed meeting you. It was great to watch you looking at the art. It's always, as an art dealer, such a pleasure when you get someone who's really looking, who's appreciating it. And I think there's a lot to see in the exhibition. Let's look at slide 1, please. Well, these are the covers of your 2 books. As I mentioned, David, Strict Beauty is just an astounding achievement. It's so rich in content about Sol LeWitt. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
How many years did you work on that book?
I think for about 5 or 6 years, I worked on Strict Beauty in terms of the initial research. It overlapped. COVID, I was very lucky that it was basically complete and ready to be published. But it is in part a catalog to an exhibition that was hosted by New Britain Museum of Art in New Britain, Connecticut, as well as the Williams College Art Museum. But it's a standalone book. In-depth study, really the first of its kind of LeWitt's printmaking.
It must have been amazing at Williams because I love the relationship between the museum and the teaching, the students. Quite an amazing institution, don't you think?
Oh yes, it was really satisfying to see the exhibition in that academic environment, especially the students engaging with the show while it was there. There was even a class of music composition students who composed music in response to some of the prints, which was very satisfying to me.
I love seeing that. I've been to the museum many times, and I love that the teachers will set up as part of the curriculum a series of works to be looked at and studied and thought about. And I found it so exciting. There's another thing in terms of Sol LeWitt. They've got a wall drawing in the stairwell, the central stairwell. And we should note, for those who don't understand the basic concept of a wall drawing, Sol LeWitt created a certificate and a diagram for each piece, and then it's executed by draftspeople. But the students actually are the draftspeople, which is what an education, don't you think?
Oh, yes. And they've changed that wall drawing several times, I think 3 times now. Yeah. So it's an experience that keeps happening at Williams.
I've been there when they're doing it, and it's interesting just to speak with the students because we had a wall drawing at my public gallery in Kent for 2 years, actually, in the lower gallery. I felt like watching it being created, I was inside the head of Sol LeWitt. It was such an interesting experience. And at one point, David, as you know, in a diagram, it'll have RR, B or whatever, which is, red, red, blue. And they put it on first in this motion like this, and then they go like this. And so it's a succession of moves that they do. And when they made a mistake, they went back. They had to go back and completely blank out one of these diagonals. And I said, God, that must be so frustrating. And I said, no, it's demanding. Like, you have to focus. This is life, and it's a lot like life. You can't make errors. You have to really be, you really have to be focused. Maria, could we see the next slide, please? So here we have LeWitt in studio twice. Would you like to talk about these two pictures?
Yeah, these two portraits of LeWitt are quite interesting. It's rare that he was photographed in his studio. The one on the left is from 1961. It appeared in the New York Times with an article that was about struggling artists and the fact that they had to take part-time jobs to exist. This photo shows him in his studio loft apartment on Montgomery Street in the Lower East Side of New York. And in 1961, I love this photograph. He's petting his cat, notice at the bottom of the image, but he's also surrounded by his paintings. So in 61, and in this article, he's presented as a painter, and you can see all of these canvases hanging around him and stacked up against the walls. So he was a struggling painter. He worked part-time at the Museum of Modern Art during this period at the reception desk. And then on the right, we have a photo taken in the early 2000s of LeWitt working in his Chester, Connecticut studio, actually working on gouaches that you can see laid out in front of him. And that's a very rare snapshot of him at work. But these two photos are kind of bookends to my current project, which deals or grapples with LeWitt and painting. So in 61, as most listeners know, he would move away from painting. By 65, he was making structures, which were featured in his first solo exhibition in New York. In 68, he created the first wall drawing, which was in pencil on a wall in Paula Cooper's gallery. So in part, the beginning of his mature career is a rejection of painting, a turning away from painting. But then by the 80s and 90s, to the end of his career, he was painting almost every day in his studio, creating gouaches on paper. And those gouache works, like the wonderful ones that are featured in your exhibition, have always been somewhat problematic. You know, how to reconcile these handmade studio paintings with his conceptual practice. So that's what my new project is trying to do, is figure out how he, over the course of his career, begins to engage with the history of painting. In 1980, he moves to Italy, where he's surrounded by these great fresco ensembles by artists that he admired from the early Renaissance and beyond. Those paintings, and that history of painting begins to impact his wall drawings. And then, of course, in the gouaches, he's so engaged with the materiality of painting. So this book really embraces the wall drawings, trying to figure out how they are linked to the history of painting, its materials, its visual effects, its spatial effects. And there's a full chapter on the gouaches as well, because there's so much about the act of painting. And I think they're a way for him to return to the painting that he had so rejected at the beginning of his career. And of course, that's abstract expressionism, which was at its height when he arrived in New York City.
Interesting. Next slide, please.
This is the cover of Irene Barbaros's a multi-volume and multifaceted Sol LeWitt project. And I just wanted to show it because this is volume 1 of a planned 2-volume set. This particular volume, Irene is a Australian artist and professor at RMIT University in Melbourne, and a long-term friend Sol LeWitt. And in this volume, she has created this fascinating photo documentation of the Chester studio. And it's full of insights about LeWitt's practice in the studio. It includes a short essay by Janet Purcell, the curator of the LeWitt collection, and also an interview between Irene and Janet, where they discuss LeWitt's practice in the studio. It's really valuable in terms of figuring out what went on in the studio. The next slide shows a kind of full view of the Chester studio, which was built in 1990, right beside LeWitt's house in Chester, Connecticut. But one thing that's revealed by Janet's essay and the interview between Irene and Janet is that LeWitt had a almost daily practice of painting gouaches in his studio. He would lay out sheets of paper, or assistants would prepare paper, small sheets of paper on the large work table in the middle of the studio, and on benches and smaller tables around the space, and also stapled to the wall that you see in the distance, this painting wall. And he could he worked simultaneously on smaller gouaches. In fact, Carol LeWitt has mentioned that he got warmed up by working on smaller works and then build up to the larger pieces. But the back wall, he could accommodate a sheet of paper that was 5 feet high by 16 feet wide. So he played music in the studio, famously interested in classical music, which would be blaring in the studio as he worked. And he talked about the way the gouaches were thoroughly integrated into the ritual of his life. So the works that he made in the studio, these gouaches, are personal in that sense and signature works. They're all about his touch, his hand creating them. Of course, in that way, they seem very contradictory to what most people know about LeWitt's work in terms of his conceptual approach.
Next, please. Here's a floating cube in our exhibition. This is actually one of the most beautiful floating cubes I've ever seen. And I found it in Rome and completely fell in love with it. David, we have a series of the cubes in the next slides, but go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is a wonderful example of a gouache that's connected to the wall drawings. You can see this wall drawing 541. I think we have one more as well. This one that was a gift from the LeWitt family to the Morgan Library. If you go back to the floating cube, I mean, many of the gouaches from the 80s into the early 90s are quite precise in terms of the rendering. As some listeners might know, gouache is a very finicky medium. It's similar to watercolor, except it relies on a denser concentration of pigment. So often the goal is to create an opaque area of color, which he was interested in. But he was also interested in mixing it. Of course, it's mixed with water. It's water-based, and he was interested in not just opacity, but also transparency. So, of course, by this point in the wall drawings, we get layers of color ink superimposed to create. Of course, he's just working in the primaries and black, gray, and white, but superimposing the primaries so he can achieve secondary colors and other hues. But you can see how precisely painted this is.
David, don't you find it interesting, the distance between this work on paper and Maria, the next slide, where they both feel like they're frescoes, and they both feel as though they relate to Fra Angelico and, Masaccio and Piero della Francesca, and, the work that was surrounding him when he lived in Spoleto, really within a short distance.
Right. And he said in many interviews that he was um, very interested in those ensembles of fresco painting and Spoleto by Giotto and nearby Assisi, as well as the Arena Chapel in Padua. Piero della Francesca, as you mentioned, who was an artist who was also a theorist of art. He wrote a book on perspective and on geometry. So I think the move to Italy really inspired in a serious way his engagement with those frescoes, and it impacted the work in terms of, I think often people refer to the kind of fresco-like color of the wall drawings, but also I think it's a spatial thing. He mentioned that, the idea of creating a total environment of painting became even more of a goal after his move to Italy. So not just one wall or two walls, but 3 and 4 walls, a whole room of painting that surrounds you.
Next, please. So we saw this. This, by the way, for anybody in New York City or visiting, please go to the Morgan Library and see it. It is mind-blowing. You feel enveloped in it. It's as though you're looking up and it surrounds you. It's just, you talked about strict beauty. It's pure beauty. It just kind of is so visceral that sometimes the first time I saw it, I got goosebumps. And I feel so grateful to the LeWitt family that this was donated. It's for everybody to enjoy. Next slide, please. So here's a quote which we took from your book. I absolutely adore this. David, would you want to read it?
Yeah, this is a short piece that LeWitt wrote about the cube. And the cube and the square were very important to his work, along with other geometric figures, but especially the cube. And he said the most interesting characteristic of the cube is that it is relatively uninteresting. Compared to any other three-dimensional form, the cube lacks any aggressive force, implies no motion, and is least emotive. So he goes on to say he uses it as a grammatical device. And then he could use that as a kind of armature on which to explore variations of color, as you see in this example on the left. So what I love about the floating cube that we started with is that it's hardly uninteresting in the sense that it becomes animated. Those floating cubes look like they're tumbling in space, and he made many wall drawings based on that motif, as well as some prints too. So I always think of the floating cube in cinematic terms, but also this cube that we see here, you can see it's to a degree a kind of tight and neat gouache painting, but also clearly in these gouaches, he's willing to loosen up his style as well as the rules. So we have these wonderful puddles of paint that describe the background as well as the facets. And this is a good example of how, actually this was made in 1991. And during this year, he was really devoted to creating many gouaches of cubes. So if we look at the next slide, in this year, he also made this series of 100 cubes. And this was shown at an art fair, as you see here in 2017 at Paula Cooper Gallery's booth. And this was eventually turned into a book that was published in 1996, which reproduces all of them in order, and there is an order, though it's a somewhat mysterious, so it's serial on some level, but the color variations aren't immediately, it's not immediately clear that they're systematic, but each cube offers a different variation of color, but also of form. So by the end of the series of 100, I definitely recommend the book, which is still available, also called 100 Cubes. By the end of the series, he's not only exploring color, but also painting. So there is this play of opacity and transparency. And in the last like 10 cubes, which you see on the lower right, the form of the cube starts to fall apart to a certain degree, to kind of blur together, and then it comes back into focus by the very last cube. So I think what we see in the gouache is a lot of experimentation in terms of the materiality of paint.
Seems to me that the greatest artists have a philosophical stance. And to me, I love this idea that a cube is inherently uninteresting. And yet you look at these 100 works, these variations, and it's completely interesting. It's like he's something super finite and he's going like that and expanding the possibilities.
Well, I mean, I think his use of geometry and geometrical figures and like the cube was a way of controlling what he was doing. He didn't want to assert some personal content or iconographic content in terms of the history of painting, but he wanted to explore color and form and optical effects. And that's what really intrigues me about his work, is that many people might hear about LeWitt's work and think it's rather formulaic or systematic or dry, but then once you engage with it, you start to see all these ways that as a viewer you can experience it, ways that are very rich.
I was in Basel, I saw this, and one
Wow.
thing that's actually moving to me, not just the work, but that he was with Paula Cooper Gallery from the very beginning. And this is a tremendous commitment on the gallery's part, that they've continued to carry the dialogue forward, to represent the work, to showcase the work in all its variations and forms. And to take a stand like this at Art Basel is a pretty industrious thing to do. So I suppose a tip of the cap to Paula Cooper and her team. I saw Paula last week, and you think about that history, that she was there with the first wall drawing. I mean, from what I understand, David, is that he did the drawing on the wall, and at the end of the show, it wasn't sold. And she said, like, what do we do now? He said, well, I'm going to make a certificate. I'm going to make a diagram. We're going to erase it. And this is what we're going to call a wall drawing. Is that what you understand as well?
Yeah, she actually called him up and asked what to do. And he said to paint it out, and she couldn't do it herself. So he apparently came to the gallery and painted out that first wall drawing on his own.
It's really kind of an homage to this incredible relationship that they had. I think there can be a critical friction between a dealer and an artist that can really move things forward.
Yeah.
Next. Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's a wall drawing that's related to the cube and these color variations. What's interesting, of course, is in the wall drawing, the goal is to create something that looks fairly uniform, right? Has what John Hogan has called a kind of democratic hand, where there's not one hand that you can identify. It's just a general all over hand. And that's very intentional. So it's very clean and very precise, quite beautiful. But the gouaches, of course, allowed LeWitt to create something that was more personal in terms of exploring the cube.
In terms of the audience out there, if people have not seen this incredible catalogue raisonné of wall drawings, compiled, edited by Susanna Singer, who's brilliant and also a dear friend, I highly recommend it, because it's the sort of book, it seems like it would be an encyclopedia, but it's endlessly fascinating because you see his instructions for the diagrams, and you see the certificates, and then the end product. And it's a very rich series of books. Next, please. I love this quote. I read it again this morning. I just absolutely love this. I don't know anything about mathematics. My art really doesn't have anything to do with mathematics, but it has to do with the way my mind works. It's just a way of making some sort of order, but a kind of order where everything is equal, nothing is superior, and nothing is inferior. David, I want to talk about that quote in relation to the gouaches, because they feel very overall, and you can't pinpoint a highlight. You can't say, wow, this is my favorite area. It's the, like, each part is part of the entire whole. Do you feel that
Yeah.
as well?
No, that's definitely true. I mean, that was part of his goal, this kind of non-hierarchical approach. So I think with all of the gouaches, for the most part, they're all over in terms of their design. So that's partly meant to defeat composition, and to treat everything equally. So no one part is more important than the other. But I like this quote as well, because I think, again, most people uh, uh, think they know LeWitt, and it must have to do with math, and they see his serial structures or wall drawings or other works. But he didn't really like that interpretation that there was something complicated and mathematical going on about his art.
And I would say again, I mean, this is one of my copies of the book. It's the kind of book that you actually could have on your bedside and flip through, because I'm not sure how you found all these quotes and put them together. It's obviously an enormous labor of love for you, but it's such an interesting book because it's so much more than just about the prints. Next slide, please. Well, this was kind of a real joy because I think, Maria, we do have a second one in too. There's kind of a phenomenal thing. We have two pieces, if we go back one slide, which were from October 6, 1972, created in Bern, Switzerland, the day of his first major museum show. And to my understanding, the two have never been put back together. So when I saw that one was available and the other, I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of a great thing. And I hope that they'll stay together. But David, let's go back, Maria, and if you could talk about this fold piece from 72.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the way that you've integrated these fold drawings in this exhibition. I mean, they are definitely connected to LeWitt's love of geometry, but also the grid. And the grid is the perfect way to create a non-hierarchical image. And so we have the grid, but also I think this is indicative of LeWitt's many of his ideas in terms of their formal expression, that he creates a situation in which there is a procedure or a plan to follow, but then he leaves in room for something to happen that he can't predict. So here, the wrinkles in the paper, the way the folds depend on the play of light and dark, so that you can see the drawing that emerges with the folds. That I think is really an important lesson with so many of his works, is that while they may be based on a system and a certain idea that motivates them, he often wanted something to happen that he couldn't control. So as I argue in Strict Beauty, it's always a balance of control and leaving room for things to happen, accidents and chance.
And
Sometimes even errors. He actually wrote that he didn't mind necessarily that errors remain in the work. So there are many works on paper and even some prints where there's appears to be a kind of error, but he left it in.
these works, as you say, they're really about controlled chance, because there's only so much we can control our environment, ultimately, how much we can control our life. So again, it gets to me to this idea of Sol LeWitt's philosophical stance, which I think is really amazing. I want to point out the back of these. I'm not sure if we have a slide of it, but on the verso of many, he wrote, not to be sold for more than $100. which then became the title of Veronica Roberts' book. And there's another book by Dieter Schwartz. Both books came out 2 years ago. And so this very underseen, undervalued group, the R series, which stands for Ripped, is coming to light. And we've done several shows of these, focus shows at the gallery, actually in this lower gallery where you're looking at Winfred Rembert behind me, which is also a joy. The Sol LeWitt show is in the upper gallery. Next slide, please.
And your mention of Veronica Roberts reminds me, earlier we had the cover of another book that I worked on called Locating Sol LeWitt. It's a book of essays where I invited 8 scholars to write work as short pieces on different aspects of LeWitt's work. And Veronica's included in that volume, along with Kirsten Swinson and Anna Lovett, and some new scholars of LeWitt's work like Erica De Benedetto and John Tyson, James Miller. So I recommend that volume as well, also published by Yale University Press. So the fold is, James, the white one, but also you show a blue and a yellow one in the show.
Those there in the slides, yeah. This photo was taken right at the end of summer. Those are flowers from our garden. And I do like the kind of relationship between art and nature. It's a big concept within my gallery because we're located in the country. So you have these geometric forms. I loved having in regular form on the left with that kind of Giotto blue, the cube in the middle, and then the cube on the right. Next slide, please. So, wow, this blue folded drawing, incredible.
Yeah, I like that you have a white, blue, and red, the primaries in this exhibition in terms of the fold drawings.
And do you want to explain the concept that Sol LeWitt had with his use of the 4 colors? Is this something you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think like many aspects of his practice, it was about simplifying, dealing with the most basic vocabulary of art in terms of lines, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, left and right, but also color. So using the 3 primaries plus a white, black, and gray was a way of simplifying and also systematizing a kind of practice. But what I think is really important about the gouaches and the wall drawings to a certain degree and the prints is the way that these simple colors, of course, can be combined to create the secondary colors and other hues. But he often wanted that to happen through layering, superimposition of the colors. And again, that falls into the end of the part of his work that sometimes just happens that he couldn't predict. And we see that in the gouaches especially.
Next slide, please. Yeah, well, here's the yellow blue.
Yeah, so this parallel curves piece, or James, did you want to talk about the yellow blue a little?
No, not at all. It's just you see the two together, and then in the work on the left, you see yellow and blue and red and white and black. I mean, it's kind of one of the points we were trying to make, to juxtapose these 3 works together.
Yeah, I love these groupings throughout the exhibition. There's one more gouache, the next one, which we could connect to the wall drawings as well, parallel curves. This is one formal language that appears here. It's 1999 in relation to other formal languages that he called loopy-doopy, loops and curves, irregular grids. That when you first see, they just seem so exuberantly alive in terms of movement, this wonderful serpentine band. Definitely, they fulfill what we were talking about earlier, an all-over approach in terms of from edge to edge. Yeah, at first glance, this looks to be not rule-oriented or following a certain system, But I have to say that all of these gouaches do have a set of rules. They're unspoken, they're not mentioned in the titles, but you can see that here the bands are of a consistent width. They're evenly spaced across the page, and each of these formal vocabularies has a set of rules in terms of what can happen. Here, parallel curves pretty much describes what you see, this kind of tracing of the form down below and as it expands upward in this parallel way. But the next two slides show the connection to wall drawings that appeared the year before, I think, in '98. These are the first wall drawings that were called Loopy Doopy, number 879. And the next one, which is at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art at Mass MoCA, 880, which is, I think, just stunning, this combination of orange and green. It's very hard to stand in that gallery and look at this wall drawing for too long because your eyes begin to vibrate. But this development in the wall drawings really, I think, surprised people because it seems so opposite of what had occurred in the wall drawings before. Of course, by this point, the wall drawings are thoroughly painted with acrylic paint. So they're really wall paintings by this point.
We should mention, David, that actually Mass MoCA is pretty much right between you in Boston and me in South Kent, Connecticut. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes from here. It's one of the great art destinations in America. For anyone who loves Sol LeWitt, get in your car and go. It's 3 floors. It's organized in a really fascinating way. You can often be one of the only people there, and you can have what we're all after with art. You can have a spiritual experience. You're going from one wall drawing to the next. They're contingent in different rooms. It's an enormous old factory. Pretty sure it's 750,000 square feet of exhibition space, with also Kiefer and many others occupying huge spaces. But that's one of my go-to places in America. It feels almost like, for me, going to Arezzo to see Piero del Francesco, or going to Florence to see Fra Angelico, San Marco. It's like a place you can go, and dependably, you can have that thing that we're after, that jolt, that art jolt. So for those who haven't been there, I would urge you to do it. And there are some great little hotels nearby, right across the street's porches. There's one called Tourists. If you have a dog, they also take dogs there. It's a great experience.
Yeah, I recommend it. I recommended it as well. That's really the exhibition that sparked my interest in LeWitt when it opened in 2008. There's 105 wall drawings on display. And by the way, the exhibition's been extended to 2043, so you have plenty of time to go. I've gone every year since 2008, sometimes more than once. So it's really a great exhibition.
It's like the first time I went to Venice, I said, oh my God, I've got to go once a year for the rest of my life. The first time I went to Mass MoCA and saw Sol LeWitt, I said the exact same thing. Once a year, I mean, there's no excuse. I'm 2 hours and 15 minutes away. I could be having a bad day and say, just get in the car, go there, and it's going to jolt you right out of it. But it's really a phenomenal experience. And what a tip of the cap we should have to the LeWitt family, to Carol, and for having organized this. And actually, Bruce Josephi is so involved as well now. The legacy of an artist is in the hands of those who take care of it. And they're doing a remarkable job. Next slide, please. Well, this is a pretty extraordinary work that we have in the exhibition.
It is. So,
thank you.
Yeah, so there's the full view of Tangled Bands from 2001. So this, like several other gouaches in the exhibition, really has nothing to do with the wall drawings. I mean, yes, you could relate it, but this particular formal language isn't found in the wall drawings. This was a point that LeWitt made late in his career, that especially by the mid to late 90s into the 2000s, what he was doing in the studio in Chester was working on ideas that were totally separate from the wall drawings. he said that, the wall drawings could be carried out by other people following his directions, but the gouaches were works that only he could do. And this is a very good example of it. And it's so intriguing to me. So this work, it's rather large. He talked a bit about the pleasure of making the gouaches, that it was about motion, the motion of his hand, of his arm, of his body. So he took a delight in that. So it's about movement, the movement of his body on some level, though he did clarify that he called it a controlled movement. He didn't mean for it to be an expressive one, like the kind of movement that you find in abstract expressionism.
We have a look at the close-up now. There we are.
In the close-up, I think you can see the way in which gouache can be very opaque, but also you can see there's some areas where you can see through the yellow to the red ground beneath, and that really does add a sense of space, shallow and even kind of a rather deep, undulating space throughout this work.
And there's a lot of nuance to look at, as which band is on top of another one, and how it becomes almost like a web of interlaced bands. And to try to unravel the order of which it was made is really pretty fascinating.
It is. And this really shows his mastery of gouache as a medium.
Mm-hmm. Next, please. There we go. Wow.
There are many of these, some large, some small horizontal brushstroke pieces that are, unlike the tangled bands, they're much more somber, I think, and meditative. They remind me of kind of the undulating surface of water. And this one's 45 by 45. There's some that are twice this width. So, using the full expanse of his arm in terms of creating these brushstrokes that extend from edge to edge and seemingly beyond the edges of the work. It's quite a display of his ability as a painter.
It's interesting because the two are quite large, and they're an interesting contrast, because this is obviously much darker. It's not really a black, it's a very deep blue with the yellow. And obviously this doesn't have quite the exuberance of the other. It's a much more subtle piece. Like you say, you feel like you could be looking at wood grain or water that's just flowing down a river very slowly. Next, please. There they are in the exhibition.
That's a great pair.
Yeah. Next, please. So this is one which has entered into our exhibition late. I had sold this work in 2014, and the collector came back to me and said, it's time for me to part with it. I was like, oh my God, let's put it in the show right now. So this isn't one that you actually saw, David, but we thought it relates in an interesting way to the other gouaches in the show. It's gray, black, and white. One thing that I find sometimes is if you let your eyes go a little bit blurry and you see just the white, it pops forward, or just the gray, or just the black. And we'll see that in squiggly brushstrokes later on.
Yeah, I agree. Often the background becomes suddenly very important. And so this figure-ground relationship becomes complicated. Yeah, so you have a number of kind of vertically oriented brushstroke pieces, this color brushstrokes, that really demonstrates a kind of his interest in what can happen when you work wet into wet and work with transparency. So I think we have a couple of details that show, he's only using the primaries plus white and black, but in close-up you can see that these mix together on the paper to create, these really subtle oranges and greens and pinks throughout the work.
Next, please.
Yeah, there you can see in the close-up. So I think when you see these in close-up, especially, I think many people wouldn't even know that these were LeWitt. They seem so different from maybe what they're familiar with, especially in the wall drawings.
Next, please.
And one thing about these, again, an all-over approach in terms of covering the page. And also these colors here, these wonderful wavy brushstrokes that go from top to bottom, they're interwoven. So he didn't lay down, the yellow, then lay down the blue, then lay down the red and the black and white. He worked simultaneously in all these colors, making the marks. So the longer you look at it, suddenly you realize that if you follow a black wavy brushstroke, that it's interwoven, it moves back and forth. That's this one, it looks rather shallow, but then suddenly it becomes kind of deep as you look into it.
This to me has the mesmerizing quality of when you're going through a car wash and you're looking at the windshield, that incredible motion. Next,
Right.
please. Oh, wow. I mean,
yeah, that's great. And you can see here that he's willing for these strokes to be opaque, transparent, brushy, so you can see individual bristles of the brush. I think once he was committed to executing the idea, he went with it. So I'm sure maybe every so often there was a disaster that occurred and he threw the work away. But I think in general, he was committed to executing it and letting it happen.
it's interesting when you build a construct for yourself, how liberating that is, how much infinite variety can come, and also maybe how it's what we all need in our life to have some restraint. And then within that restraint, there's this incredible variety once you really look. Next, please. Just a view of the gallery. Next, please. So yeah, another wavy.
Yeah, another brush. This one's a little more controlled in terms of the opaque bands of color. But again, you can see underneath there are brushstrokes going kind of in a vertical orientation for the most part. So there are many gouaches where he would layer one drawing on top of the other, and you get these kind of tantalizing glimpses of something else within the space of the work beneath.
Next, please.
Yeah.
And on the left, you really see that the verticality, it feels almost like a Morris Lewis stripe, and then he comes in with his incredible lines. Next, please.
I think, yeah, this is interesting too. I mean, I loved all of these gouaches in the exhibition, horizontal brushstrokes, but with this layer of black brushstrokes on the top. This connects to a tendency in LeWitt's work over the course of his career. He was interested sometimes in obscuring or hiding elements of the work. So sometimes he only implied that they were there. Here he actually lets you look through and see all of this incredible color underneath. And also you can see in the close-up the way he dragged the black or the brushstrokes from the left. They're quite dense, and then they become thinner and thinner until there's barely any pigment in the watery brushstroke, so you can look through them.
It feels to me almost like looking through black Venetian blinds at these colors behind. It seems like he can be very interested in foreground and background, but perhaps it's just the way it worked out. And on the left, you could see these almost stop marks,
Yeah.
stop marks. I'm not sure, but they're really incredible. Next, please.
Oh, and this is really my favorite of your exhibition, this squiggly brushstrokes from 1997. This can be connected to pieces he made in the 1970s, two lithographs that use this squiggly little line throughout. In those lithographs, the squiggly marks were not supposed to touch each other. They were supposed to be not touching. And also in 1997, he made a print at Crown Point Press of this kind of squiggly brushstroke overlapping. It's a beautiful sugar lift aquatint where the overlapping colors blend together. So if you look closely at this, again, he started by painting the entire sheet a light blue, and then proceeded to cover it with these marks in the primaries plus white and black. And in the close-ups, you can see that he allowed all of this kind of interaction to occur, which is really a product of this water-based medium of gouache. So if we look at the details, the next slide, you can see the way these marks are hardly defined as they touch each other and bleed into each other. Are on the right, in the lower right corner of the piece, you can see a black and white squiggly brushstroke that become one. But this is just rich in, I mean, it really has to be seen up close. I mean, this is one thing about a lot of LeWitt's work, is that it has to be experienced in full, sometimes at a distance, but then you really need to engage with it up close. So many of the prints, and I think the gouaches, are really beyond being photographed. They have to be shown in full and then shown up close in details like this.
Next, please. Another gallery view. Next. Irregular form.
Yeah, this irregular form in 1997, 98, and 99, he started to pursue what he called irregular forms. This is a small work, about 11 by 11 inches. He created really large, 5 by 5 foot irregular forms. A little like the loopy-doopy and parallel curves. These works kind of flirt with representation. These remind me so much of kind of aerial views of coastlines. So they look topographical, or about cartography in a certain way. So I think they're very evocative works. And this particular one was created, if you can show the next slide, for creating a photomechanical portfolio, this portfolio of 12 offset lithographs, and you can see the one in the exhibition in the bottom row. This is shows you the full array. The one that's in your exhibition is the only one, the original gouache, that I've been able to discover. But you can see the variety of these irregular forms. They remind me, I mean, like other gouaches and some of the things that I've been talking about. I think this was a way for LeWitt, in terms of creating gouaches in these different languages, a way to return to painting. This reminds me so much of color field painting, of Helen Frankenthaler, for instance, her pores and stains of paint. We get LeWitt's version of that, highly controlled, but I think still very evocative.
Some of them look like the footprints for the splotch structures, which he did late in his career. Next, please. Another exhibition view. Next.
Yeah, these torn paper pieces. James, I think is such a great juxtaposition, the irregular form gouache, with these earlier torn paper pieces, where he was allowing something to happen that he couldn't completely control in terms of making these rips.
It's an interesting thing also, because it's ripped, but it also is a fold, a vertical fold right down the middle. And next slide, please. There's an inscription for this piece for Germano Celant, who was the Italian art historian who came up with the term arte povera. Here's a picture of Germano, and it's inscribed to him, which seemed incredibly powerful to me, to actually have this as a document for our exhibition.
And also you could see why that particular piece appealed to him in terms of what was going on in Italian art, which LeWitt was totally interested in, the use of humble materials and very simple gestures like tearing the paper.
You know, humble is a really interesting word in relation to Sol LeWitt. I think there's an awful lot of humility and humor, and people don't talk about that much. But the location of geometric forms, when he's saying like a square located between the midpoint of the upper right and, you know, 1/3 across from the bottom left. And there's this long sentence that is so funny because it's completely direct and accurate, but you can hardly follow it. Like your brain can't synthesize all the ideas, which I find so interesting. This, of course, is R78, which is related to the other one from October 6th, 72. Next, please. So here's one which is actually ripped and folded, really much like the black one, which we saw the homage to, or the inscription, Germano Celant.
And it shows in a perfect way both tendencies in LeWitt's work, tendency to control things, to plan them, to approach things in terms of rules and systems, that wonderful precise fold, and then willingness to allow things to happen that he can't fully control in terms of tearing the edges.
I'd always been obsessed with Sol LeWitt, but a friend of mine in Rome, Max Renkel, he consigned a piece to me, which was similar to this one. So it's ripped and folded. And what I found, I showed it at the Armory show in probably 2011 or 2012. The most intelligent people came to look at it. And I found that it filtered people out. It was such an interesting experience to me. And then that started my obsession with the R series, a piece very, very similar to this one. And it went to a trustee of Mass MoCA, which I found also really interesting. Next slide, please. Yeah, David, we put this in for a reason. Maybe you could talk about this, but you do talk about it in your book. And we have the quote, I believe it's the absolute next slide. Can you read that, or is it covered? Is it covered by the
No, I can yes. Yeah, actually, yeah, I'm surprised by these slides, but happy too, because wall drawing 46 is really the work that drew me in to LeWitt and to my interest in LeWitt. This is a wall drawing that he dedicated to his dear friend and fellow artist, Eva Hesse, in 1970. She had passed away just a few days before he created this work in Paris. And it was a moment when he borrowed something of Hesse's. Her work was, in contrast to his, relatively more intuitive and organic. And so this is considered the first time he uses a freehand line. Up to this point, he had been creating straight lines that were created with the assistance of rulers and straight edges. So this work is really mesmerizing to see in person. And I learned that he had made a series of prints connected to it. And so that's was my entry into LeWitt's work, since most of my scholarship had been on the history of printmaking. But yeah, the quote is nice. It starts simple, but becomes more complex as it proliferates. This idea of mathematics and pure logic, I mean, this is something that's repeated a lot about LeWitt's work, but I think this particular wall drawing contrasts to that notion in the ways that we've been discussing throughout this discussion.
Very fascinating thing, David, where he's got a system of logic and then he goes outside of it.
Right.
I was moved because you had mentioned to me in one of your conversations how wall drawing 46 is what led you. And this morning I asked Dylan Everett, who, really put together this brilliant PowerPoint to include it. I'm going to read the quote because it's partly covered. LeWitt's work is all about logic. Oh, this is by Kurt Varnado, MoMA, the brilliant, brilliant art historian and curator. LeWitt's work is all about logic, module, and repetition. It starts simple, but becomes more complex as it proliferates. It expresses the optimism of mathematics, the clarity and beauty of logic. And I just adore that. I think it's such an amazing quote. Next, please. So, David, this is my old public gallery in Kent. The very first show we did was called Sol LeWitt in Connecticut. Because Sol LeWitt, we think of him as being in Lower Manhattan and Spoleto and the Amalfi Coast, And of course, Chester was his long-term home. He's actually one of the greatest artists in the history of Connecticut. So for my first exhibition, I wanted to point that out. So you're looking at, obviously one of the gouaches in the middle, and then our series behind it. And there's a vertical to the left, which it's in the books, and it's designated as the collection of Jasper Jones, so I can actually say that. Jasper lives in our area, Sharon, 20 minutes away, and he came in a few times and looked at it, said, okay, that one, which was pretty thrilling for me with my first exhibition, having returned from Rome. Next slide, please. Another view of the pyramids, which we're not going to have time to talk about, but another series that he did. Next, please. And here we had a piece. The structure is an interesting cube, which was lent for the exhibition by Paula Cooper Gallery. And I'm not sure if we have a picture of it, but I had a painting from the 1960s in the front vestibule. Next, please. This is wall drawing 701, which we installed at the gallery in my lower gallery, and I kept it up for 2 years. I wanted to show Connecticut to my local constituency that we were going to do a different type of gallery, that we were going to really reach for the stars, and to get this through the estate of LeWitt, through Paula Cooper, was a dream. They gave me a choice of 4, and I was like, wow, well, I'm taking 701. I just love this piece. This relates, for those who missed it at the gallery, you could go to Mass MoCA and see related work, extremely close. Next, please. Oh
yeah, so this is an excerpt from Strict Beauty, and this was a bit of information that was unearthed by Larry Bloom, the first biographer of LeWitt, and it's expressive of the young LeWitt, 16 years old. And in this edition of his high school newspaper, he had these parting words: "Let us search continually for beauty, for it is only in beauty that we shall find full happiness. Let us always try to enrich our thoughts through new experiences, for thought is really life's only reality." So this very early commentary on thought and beauty, and these are two of the key terms, critical terms, that scholars have used in terms of discussing LeWitt's work.
I love that you have this quote in your book. Also, that sometimes in the art world, people say, well, it's just beautiful, or, it's decorative, as though these are pejorative terms. And they're not. This search for beauty in Sol LeWitt is so inspiring, and it's so truthful. Anyway, a great quote from 54. Next, please. Just an overview of the exhibition. And that is our last slide. If anyone who's looking has a question, please, how do they do it? Do they make a comment, Maria? You can make a comment. If you have any question for David, please look at it. David, is there anything you want to add to this? Or could you please talk just a little bit more about where you are in the research of your forthcoming book?
Well, as I was mentioning to James earlier before we began, I've been on sabbatical this semester, and conducting short research trips to various collections in the United States to look at gouaches, and to research the wall drawings. And so I'm kind of, at the beginning and also beginning to write parts of the project. But as I mentioned earlier, it embraces the wall drawings, trying to approach them in a new way in terms of thinking of them in relation to the history of painting. I mean, early on in LeWitt's career, there was a lot of attention to drawing. Of course, he asserted that he was creating drawings from the very beginning with the wall drawings, and they were in pencil for the most part, and then crayon. So this connection to drawing has been well established in the literature on LeWitt, but not as much has been done about the history of painting and how he engaged with it. So 2 summers ago, I spent 5 weeks in Italy, looking at these various frescoes that he had cited as influential, and thinking about the way certain visual and spatial effects were emulated by LeWitt in the wall drawings. So as I mentioned, there are at least 2 chapters on the wall drawings in terms of space, materiality, and then 1 full chapter on the gouaches, which, as I mentioned earlier, for the most part, are totally separate from the wall drawings in terms of what his goals and what he achieved.
Well, I'd like to wish you the very best with that book and to commend you, not on just the 2 books, but also this continuing research you're doing. It's so important. And this is a book that I know those of us like me who are obsessed with Sol LeWitt can't wait to read. And for those of you out there, I would urge you, get a copy of Strict Beauty, keep it by your bedside, read a couple pages a night. It's so rich in content, and it will change the way you think about Sol LeWitt, possibly even the way you think about art and life. David, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone at James Barron Art for having me and arranging this.